Good afternoon. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to see so many of you here. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm really, really excited about today, about the energy you can feel when you just walk in the room already. And I'm keen to be hearing from all of you. Hopefully I have a chance to talk to some of you later on about your experiences of the talks that you've attended today. I'm going to be speaking to you today, not actually about the curriculum review, or at least not very much, but mainly about curriculum characteristics of high-performing education systems. I have spent the past decade or so working with local and national governments on education policy and working with curriculum as part of that. And so I've had various experiences of how curriculum can go wrong in various countries. So I have been, was working with a government in a small East Asian kingdom in which there was, in year 3, there was the 2 times table, can't have been year 3. Maybe it was the 5 times table and the 6 times table. Anyway, 2 of the times tables were in this curriculum, but no other times tables were anywhere else. I've been in schools in Sweden where I was being shown around a secondary school by a teacher, and we entered a classroom where the young people were learning about food webs. And the teacher whispered to me, "Oh gosh, my children did this in year 4. And I've been in Abu Dhabi, where I was reviewing the education system in Abu Dhabi, and this poor head teacher came over to me and insisted that I took home with me 2 textbooks as an indication of just how much they had to cover in those lessons. So I have seen the curriculum go wrong in various different ways. And I've experienced that as well as a teacher myself in a secondary school in southwest London many years ago now. But the experience is one in which I felt that the system level education policy was not supporting me to do my work as a teacher to improve the lives of those young people. And that experience got me both obviously quite frustrated, but also very interested in how these things were done in other countries. So where is it going well? How can systems be structured in such a way? How can a curriculum be written in such a way that it actually helps educators to do that important work of educating young people? So I have spent time working in some high-performing education systems as well. I was in Finland, Japan, Shanghai, Canada, Shanghai. Did I say that twice? New Zealand. I've just got off a plane, forgive me if I forget a country. So I've spent some time in these high-performing education systems. I'm going to share a couple of key features of what these curricula have in common. Now, this comes from partly my own experience in these high-performing education systems, but also 2 other sources that I'll draw on. One is some research from some American researchers when they looked at many different, over 40 different curricula in high-performing education systems. And they said, what do these curricula have in common that the lower-performing systems don't have? So I'll be drawing on that. And then secondly, I'm sure you'll expect this by now, I imagine, from today, but a little bit of cognitive science as well. But firstly, I want to share a quote, actually, from a girl I met called Sophie. And I met Sophie in Canada, although Sophie was Chinese. So she'd spent the first 15 years of her education in Shanghai, and then she had moved to Ontario and was attending high school in Ontario. So she was uniquely placed from a student perspective to tell me about the differences between these 2 systems. And for the purposes of this illustration, it's important that you know that although Canada is in general a high performer, certainly for the West, it is nowhere near as high performing in international tests of maths, reading and science as certainly as Shanghai. So this was Sophie's main observation. So Sophie, what are the big differences between these 2 education systems that you have experienced? She said the most significant difference I find is the depth of material covered. In Canada, they do a little bit of everything, and they do it really fast before you really get the essence of that part, and then they jump into something else. Whereas in China, they go on about some knowledge for quite a long time, maybe several weeks, before they move to the next topic. So you get a lot of practice, and you really know it. So her experience as a student of the main difference between these 2 vastly different education systems in vastly different countries was actually one of the key curriculum features that researchers have identified as being important when it comes to successful curricula, and that is focus. So what I mean by focus, fewer topics in greater depth per year. So this is from some research from Schmidt and colleagues in the US. As I said, over 40 different curricula they analysed, which must have taken them a very, very long time indeed, because it does take a long time to do this kind of work. And they identified that this key feature was what these high-performing systems had in common. So there's a nice illustration, this is also from Schmidt, of two different piles of textbooks here. One on the left is Japanese textbooks, and on the right is American textbooks. And you can see that the Japanese textbooks are much thinner. There is less content in them. On average, 10 mathematics topics in 8th grade in Japan, rather than 30 in America. And again, just for the context, Japan is a high performer in mathematics. America is average, kind of middling in terms of its rankings. So it's partly about that focus. It's about fewer topics, but it's also about clarity on what those topics are. Because you can have a curriculum which doesn't have very much in it, but what is in it is so high level and vague that yes, there's not very much, but we're also not quite sure what it is that students are supposed to learn. And I would suggest that the current curriculum in Northern Ireland is such a curriculum. Now, what you might think is fewer topics in greater depth per year. You might think, well, that must mean that by the time these children get to the end of their education, they've covered less stuff. They know less, because they're doing less content per year. But actually, surprisingly, that's not the case. I'm going to return to Schmidt once again, and then I will stop talking about Schmidt, I promise. But to explain why that does not mean that overall children end up learning less. So he's comparing here high-performing systems to America. So our intended content is highly repetitive. We introduce topics early and then repeat them year after year. To make matters worse, very little depth is added each time the topic is addressed, because each year we devote much of the time to reviewing the topic. So when you're not clear about what it is that students, what the essential learning that children need to know, or skills that they need to be able to have, then what you end up doing is actually, well, we'll have to do it again the next year and again the next year, because we didn't really necessarily master it that first time. And I want to pull on an example from Northern Ireland here. And this is not actually from the curriculum itself, but from the lines of development document that supports the primary maths curriculum. And I've just set it up next to the equivalent curriculum in Singapore. And this is not exhaustive, this is not all of the content. I've just pulled out a few examples here about fractions. So in the lines of development document, in various different levels here, you've got recognize and use simple fractions such as half and a quarter. Then you've got use and interpret simple fractions such as a half and a quarter and a third. Then you've got use and interpret simple fractions including half and a quarter, a third and 3/4. So you can see that each time there's quite a lot of repetition there. It's not entirely clear what the difference is between recognize and use and interpret. And so what that can potentially mean, and of course this will be interpreted differently in different schools, but what that can potentially mean is that there'll be some children who won't really grasp, well, what exactly is half and what is a quarter. And therefore, when they come back to that later on, they still don't really understand it, but it's getting a little bit harder, but they're not quite sure what that is or how to use it. And so some children just get left behind. In contrast, in Singapore, you can see that it's much clearer. And of course, this is just what's in the national curriculum, but this will then be further exemplified through textbooks in Singapore. But there'll be equivalent fractions. We know what equivalent fractions are in the way that using and interpreting is slightly more woolly. Adds and subtracts, unlike fractions. Again, that will need more explication in terms of what exactly does that mean, but that does give much more clarity than the equivalent in Northern Ireland. And as a result, you can build on that each year rather than having to return and repeat. Of course, you do revisit always, but you're not having to reteach it as if from scratch. So what that means is that at each stage in these high-performing systems, enough time is spent to ensure that all children are secure in the foundations that they need for that future learning, because there is that focus and that clarity, which means that you've got the vast majority of pupils progressing through the curriculum at the same pace, rather than some students being on a much slower trajectory and some being on a much faster trajectory. Academically weaker pupils, and forgive that's a poor phrasing, but students who are struggling or might struggle more often in mathematics or in another subject are supported to reach the standard that they need to progress through the curriculum. So all students will have at least this knowledge, this is what they're going to need if they're going to access that learning later on. And then those students who are picking things up much more quickly, and for them that's quite basic, they're encouraged to explore that content in greater depth or breadth. So that's focus. The other big and important curriculum feature of these high-performing systems is coherence. Oh, I did say I was going to stop talking about Schmidt. I lied, sorry. So coherence is the other feature, key feature that they identified. And I will use their words here, and then I will explain what that means, because it is not the most immediately obvious, I think, from this particular quote. But they say curricula are coherent if they are articulated over time as a sequence of topics and performances that are logical and reflect, where appropriate, the sequential or hierarchical nature of the disciplinary content from which the subject matter derives. Yeah, exactly. So the key thing I want you to pick up from this, and I'm going to talk a bit more about it in a moment, but is that it's based on the sequential or hierarchical nature of the disciplinary content. So exactly what this looks like and how it works is going to work differently in different subjects, depending on the discipline that's underpinning a subject. Fundamentally, what it means at a bigger picture level is that in your curriculum, you've got knowledge and related skills sequenced in a curriculum in such an order that at every stage, students already have the prerequisite understanding or ability that they need to access the new learning. So for example, I suppose it's most obvious in hierarchical subjects, but it's also true in non-hierarchical subjects. So hierarchical subjects being like maths and science, where obviously children need to understand what fractions are before they can really comprehend, well, what does it mean to add a fraction? But the same applies in other subjects as well. So if you want students to understand devolution, devolved government in Northern Ireland, if you were to go straight into that as a new topic and the students have not come across the concept of democracy anywhere else, some students in particular are really going to struggle with that. So you would want in a coherent curriculum that them to have been introduced to this idea of democracy and other relevant prior knowledge, contextual knowledge first, to set them up for that new learning. Bringing that back to Northern Ireland and the curriculum review in particular, I've picked one quote here, and I could have picked hundreds of others, maybe hundreds is a slight exaggeration, many others. So many Year 8 teachers talk to me about the problem of flexibility in the current Northern Ireland curriculum. One example, possibly too much flexibility in the way schools can interpret the programmes of study for each subject, leading to large variations in how the curriculum is interpreted in different schools. Now, that leads to a couple of problems. Partly, if as post-primary teachers, you don't know exactly what it is that students have done in primary school, even if they do have relevant prior learning for what you're about to teach, you're not able to make that obvious for them. You're not able to say, oh, well, remember when you did this thing? Because it will be different for different students. And secondly, it will be different for different students. So in that one classroom, you'll have such a range of prior knowledge that it makes it much more difficult to build on prior learning. And we did have a look at this in the teacher survey that we sent out as part of the curriculum review. We asked teachers of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 to what extent they'd covered various different concepts. Climate change was one of them. And this is just the Key Stage 2 teachers. This is what the Key Stage 2 teachers said. So about 13% said they don't teach this at all at Key Stage 2. They've not taught climate change at all. About 53% say they've touched on it briefly. And about 33% say it's a main focus of a topic. So what that means then, if we convert that into a class of 30 children, you've got 4 children who've never heard of it, or potentially certainly haven't been taught it, 16 children that think they know about it, but potentially quite a lot of misconceptions, depending on how briefly they've touched on it, and then 10 children who've done it as the main focus of a topic, and they're really, miss, we've done this. We did this for half a term, miss. So it's quite a contrast, and that does make it difficult obviously for the teacher, but also for the children, because you're going to have 4 children there who are going to feel, gosh, secondary school's hard, everyone else knows about this thing, I don't know about this thing, and teachers who are, based on the fact that most of the children seem to know about it, maybe spend a bit less time on it and move on a bit more quickly, and there are some kids that might potentially then get left behind. Then there's the opposite problem, where you have I got one more? Yeah. So adaptation, as an example. So in this case, you've got 10 children who haven't been taught it, 16 children who've been taught it briefly and 4 children who did it as a main focus of the topic. And in this instance, you'll think, well, actually, broadly speaking, most of my class haven't done this before. We're going to go into depth on what adaptation is. And this time you've got 4 children who think, oh, this is a bit boring. We've done this before. So unless you're a highly, highly skilled teacher with lots of time to develop some really fantastic extension activities, you're going to have some children who are going to become a bit disengaged because this is old news for them. So why then is coherence over time and across year groups so important? Even more important than is already obvious is because children and adults learn by connecting new learning with something that they already know. And that's probably obvious to all of you because you're all educators. But this is a really, really important finding from cognitive science that we all need to think about more in our curriculum planning. And they do that by incorporating it into their existing schemata, which is probably a term that you've come across today from a few people. But I am going to talk about what that means. So the sequence of content in the curriculum is therefore absolutely crucial. And if children are learning by connecting something to things that they already know, I mean, this is something that we all do, isn't it, as educators? You will automatically think, right, what can I link this to that all of the young people will have had experience with in their lives? So you might say, oh, okay, teaching electric circuits. Oh, have you ever noticed how if the fuse goes, not only the lights go off, but your cooker doesn't work either? You know, you'll be grasping for, how can I relate this to something that everyone already knows about? And that's an important thing to do, of course, to connect the learning to children's own lives. But it's so much easier if you can also connect it to, remember what you were doing when you were doing your electric circuits in year 6. Tell me about what you remember. Let's build on that. So schema, they provide a really powerful way of thinking about curriculum coherence in particular. So a schema is a cognitive structure representing a person's knowledge about a concept, entity, or situation, including its qualities and the relationships between them. What I want to focus on here is how powerful they are on our thinking and our experience of the world. So they exert powerful influences over how events are perceived, interpreted, and remembered. I'm going to give you a really trivial example and then a proper example. So a really trivial example is me and cars. No one really talked to me much about cars growing up. No one in my family is particularly interested in cars. Didn't learn about cars at school. I have no particular interest in cars. Cars are important, different types of cars, clearly. But as a result, I've never kind of developed a schema for different makes and models of cars. I haven't really got one. Therefore, I'm not interested in it. Therefore, when there are opportunities to hear about them or learn about them, I've avoided it. Therefore, I literally have done a whole curriculum review visiting schools around Northern Ireland with wonderful Peter picking me up in the same car every single time. And every time I came out of a school, I had to follow Peter into the car park because I could not point out which one is Peter's car in this whole car park. Because I don't even see. I don't even notice because I know so little about cars and makes and models of cars. I'm sorry that's such a stereotype, isn't it? Sorry. I'm not always this stereotypical. But I don't even see that this is a... I still don't know what kind of car he drives. It's silver. Right, slightly more serious example from Bartlett, this is very, very old theory, actually, schema theory, but very, very useful, has lasted to this day and predicts all kinds of things. But Bartlett was the first psychologist to come up with this concept of schema. And he did a study in which he got some American students who were not from a Native American background, and he read them a story about a Native American story about a battle. And then later on, he asked them to recall what they remembered about the story and retell the story. Now, because they were not familiar with Native American stories, concepts, ideas, what they remembered about the story, they had changed. They actually remembered something different to what they were told to make it fit in with things that they did know about. So in the story, someone falls down on the floor and it says something black came out of his mouth. And then he was dead. And when the students were asked to retell the story later on, they said, and then he had a fit. So because they understood and were more familiar with kind of modern Western medicine, they heard that as he had a fit, even though the story said something black came out of his mouth. So they actually remembered something differently because of their existing schema and because of the knowledge that they didn't have. So both in terms of what their schema were and what their schema wasn't. So a coherent curriculum ensures that for every new topic, children have existing schemata to build on to help them make sense of and remember that new learning. So you can see how this is particularly important for students who don't necessarily have the means or the family support to fill in kind of key gaps at home, things that might be missing from their background knowledge. This deliberate planning of curriculum to make sure that the students have what they need at each stage of their education is really, really in support of those students who are already disadvantaged. And of course, it's not only about this vertical coherence, this coherence over time, but also, these schemas don't exist in isolation. It's also really important that there are horizontal links, that it's a horizontally coherent curriculum, so that we join up those schemas, so we point out the connections between different subjects, so that students don't only think of, oh, well, this is history and this is geography, but that they are aware of all of the rich linkages between all of the different subjects when they're studying the world. So I'm going to finish just by sharing an example of a curriculum from Singapore. Singapore is consistently the highest performing education system in the world in terms of reading, maths, science, global competence, critical thinking, and all sorts of other important things. And this is not to say that this is the only way or the best way of doing it, but this is just an example of a national curriculum which is both coherent and focused. So you have, this is their primary curriculum. They have divided it up into a few different themes down the side here: diversity, cycles, systems, interactions, and energy. And they've structured it in such a way that teachers of upper primary can look back to lower primary and see, okay, well, what is it that they learnt in lower primary that I can directly build on, that I can get children to recall and then link in this new learning? So within each of these, within systems, there's more connection. There's the plant system. They're learning about plant parts and functions. And then plant system again, but this time it's respiratory and circulatory systems. So you can almost see a schema forming there about plants and how do plants work, and some very basic ideas happening in lower primary, and then those being built on at upper primary. But also, there's not very much there. There is obviously more than this, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to click through in a minute. But this means that there's about 4 to 5 topics per year that the children are covering. I'm going to zoom into this bullet point here, diversity of living and non-living things, to see what content sits beneath it. So each topic's then exemplified with knowledge, including specific vocabulary. So what do we want? We want them to know about amphibians, birds, fish, insects, mammals, and reptiles. We want them to be able to describe the characteristics of living things. And then they've also linked in, well, what are the things that we want children to be able to do with that? And then ethics and attitudes as well. And all of that represents about a quarter of a year's worth of learning. The same themes run through into secondary science in Singapore, but if you look at secondary science in Singapore, there is more in there. There's more content. So it's not always the case that this is like an appropriate amount of content. But the reason that there's more, and the reason that that is still focused and that is still appropriate, is because of the power of having this in primary school. Because if you have this in primary school, so let's take cells, for example. If you have a primary curriculum in which every student has been exposed to and hopefully learned the basic idea of a cell, an animal cell, and they're secure with the word nucleus, and they're secure with the word membrane. If you then come to secondary school and you're trying to teach them about immune system response, for example, they've already got a starting basis. When you're talking about the difference between white blood cells and red blood cells, they already know a lot about cells. So actually you are able to really start to run with it at a post-primary level, because children have that security with some basics that they've learned in primary school. And the same thing would apply within post-primary as well. Within that, the difference between the beginning of Key Stage 3 and the end of Key Stage 3, and then into Key Stage 4. So this is just to give you an illustration of a couple of key features of high-performing education systems, both of which, focus and coherence, were in my recommendations for the Northern Ireland curriculum. And that is something that we'll be working on together. And I say together because I'm really, really excited that there is an open call for people to apply to be part of these groups that are going to be writing this new curriculum. It is amazing professional development. I've worked with teachers on curricula elsewhere, and it's phenomenal, the kind of conversations that you end up having about coherence. Just makes you think differently as a teacher. So please do apply, please do let your staff apply, and we're really, really keen to work with as many of you as possible at this very exciting time for Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.